On my 68th birthday, a small box arrived in plain brown paper. No return address, just two narrow words on a card. Happy birthday. Written in a hand I knew like old road signs. The handwriting of my son, Ethan, whom I hadn't seen in 3 long years. It reached straight through my ribs and squeezed. Not joy exactly, more like a weight finding its seat. And before I tell you what fell out of that box and what nearly took 2 lives, I'll say this. If you've ever been cut off by your own blood and still kept the porch light on, stay with me. And if this kind of hard, honest story is your thing, tap subscribe so you don't miss where this goes next. Because what came wrapped in tissue and silence was a limited edition bottle of whiskey, emerald label, gold script, the kind meant to live on a shelf like a trophy, flickering in the morning sun that fell through my kitchen blinds. I turned it in my hands, and the glass held a little storm inside. But I haven't touched a drop since the cardiologist cleared his throat and told me if I wanted to see 70, I'd have to start wanting other things. And Ethan had stood right there then, thumbs busy on his phone, while the doctor talked about salt and spirits and second chances. Linda, my late wife, used to pour us a finger on Sundays, and we'd sit on the porch swing, letting the crickets do the talking. And losing whiskey wasn't the hardest loss. But it taught me how to say no without ceremony. So I didn't pull the wax, didn't crack the seal, just slid the bottle to the far end of the table and let the clock tick around it until the light moved off the label. By early afternoon, I buckled that ridiculous bottle into the passenger seat of my old Chevy out of pure habit and drove it over to Robert Carson, my daughter-in-law's father, the kind of neighbor who brings tools before you ask and climbs a ladder before you admit you need one. His white house on the rise, looking like a postcard, sawdust still clinging to his boots when he opened the door. And when I said it was a gift from Ethan, and I couldn't use it, he turned it in his hands and laughed soft the way a man laughs at a small mercy, told me he'd make tonight special, and I told him that was the point. Driving home under that thin, honeyed October light, the fields cut low, and the burn piles smoking steady, something in me itched. This, a gesture, a jab, a bridge. At supper, I ate alone, pot roast for one, and when the landline rang a little past nightfall, I leaned on the counter and listened to my boy's voice come through easy as a salesman's. Happy birthday, did you get my gift? I said I did, told him I'd passed it along to Robert, and the silence that followed didn't belong to a phone company. It belonged to a man doing math he hadn't planned to do. He breathed out like he'd just torn a ticket in half and hung up. Sleep came thin and broke easy. And the next day, the hour not yet busy, the call came from Linda Carson, Robert's wife, steady-hearted, her voice tightened by hallways and fluorescent light. She said Robert had collapsed after breakfast, and the doctors were whispering about poison. My coffee went from warm to useless in my hand, and my eyes cut to the refrigerator where a mason jar sat with a stubborn finger of amber I'd poured as a courtesy taste before gifting the bottle. Something I'd forgotten until that word, poison, found the hinge on my memory. And when I lifted the kitchen trash lid, I saw a small white vial the size of a vitamin bottle, clean cap screwed tight, no label. A dusting of pale powder tracing the inside like winter on a window. I didn't remember throwing it away, and I didn't believe it had thrown itself. So I called Gary, a friend from my service days who runs a little veterinary lab out by the fairgrounds, a man who owes me a toe and pays his debts in competence. And I told him I needed quiet testing on a sample. Nothing dramatic, just the truth. And he didn't make a speech, just told me to bring what I had and not to mention his name to anyone breathing official air. Near dusk, I handed him the mason jar, wrapped in a paper sack, and the little vial I'd pulled from the trash. And he said he'd work after closing, told me to go home and lock my doors. I didn't sit when I got back. I walked the rooms with my hands behind my back like a man checking fence lines. And when the phone rang the next day, not long after the sun cleared the maples, Gary's voice had the calm you use when you talk to someone standing too close to the edge. "Frank, there's white snake root in that whiskey, precisely extracted, dosed to slip past the tongue and find a weak heart fast." And I closed my eyes because the house suddenly sounded different. The refrigerator hummed like a warning, the clock like a metronome keeping time for a song I didn't want to learn. And I knew then the bottle wasn't a gift, it was a message, and the man who sent it was still my son. I didn't waste a minute after Gary said the word snake root. I drove to St. Luke's with a knot riding my sternum and found Robert under hospital light that bleached everything honest. Monitors keeping time like a metronome for the living, and Linda's fingers laced so tight they looked welded. I told the attending exactly what Gary had told me in smaller, meaner syllables. Plant toxin, likely white snake root, and watched the doctor's face do that professional stillness that means he's surprised, but won't hand the surprise to anyone else. Then orders started moving through the room. Labs, fluids, rhythm checks. And Linda's eyes filled without spilling, as if tears would cost too much right then. So I leaned in and told Robert, in a voice that wouldn't shake, that he'd keep breathing, because that's the job today, nothing more. And he gave me the smallest half-smile a stubborn man can afford. I stepped into the hallway, called Gary again, made him repeat the mechanism like reciting a prayer. Cardiotoxin, dose-dependent, no accidents at those levels. And when I hung up, I felt older by a decade and clearer by an inch. On the drive home, the town looked the way a battlefield looks after smoke lifts. The same houses, the same porches. Only now, every shadow was a question. And when I walked into my kitchen, the silence met me with its old, blunt honesty. I went straight to the trash, because I'm a man who checks the hinge before the door, lifted the bag, and felt the blood move cold. Someone had turned it around. And the little white vial I'd noticed earlier was gone, not misplaced, gone. My locks were set, my windows latched, and there's no key under a mat at my place. Never has been. So I stood there for 10 counted seconds and let the realization do its work. Whoever touched that bottle knew exactly where to look and what to take. I didn't panic. I made coffee. I wouldn't drink, and pulled a yellow legal pad. Drew a line down the middle, the way I learned back when lists were the only thing that kept me from flying apart. What I know on the left, what I can prove on the right, and wrote in plain letters like a carpenter chalking cuts. Ethan sent the gift. Ethan asked if I'd tried it. Gary found snake root, vial missing. Then I picked up my old pocket recorder, checked the red light, slid it into my jacket because sometimes evidence is the only prayer you get. I called the non-emergency line and asked for Detective Reyes by name. He answered steady, let me put one sentence on top of another without rushing, told me to keep the remaining sample cold, bag the packaging, and write down every time my phone rang and what it said, even if all it said was nothing. Then he asked the question I'd been trying not to answer. Who else has a key? And I heard myself say what I already knew. That 3 years ago, after my heart scare, Ethan had fetched things from this house, and I never saw my spares again. By late afternoon, the light went thin and metallic, the kind that slides under a man's collar, and I walked the perimeter like it was still my job. Back door, garage entry, basement window wells. Everything looked untouched in that infuriating way. A careful hand leaves no fingerprints. Around 5, I threaded a sliver of black cotton across the inside of each frame and anchored it with transparent tape low. A trick I learned from a corporal who hated finding his locker rifled and wanted evidence quieter than an alarm. Then I sat at the table, the legal pad open, and called Linda to give her only what could help. Doctors were treating the right problem now. Numbers moving in a kinder direction. I'd be back in the morning. And when I hung up, the house breathed like an animal sleeping, full of small clicks and sighs that mean nothing until they mean everything. Just before dusk, my landline rang with that old rotary urgency the world forgot. No caller ID, one breath of silence. Then the line died, and I wrote down the time because Reyes had asked me to trust the pencil more than my memory. I ate standing at the sink because chairs made me feel slow, and as the day folded itself up, I understood the shape of it. This wasn't about a bottle anymore. It was about a line, and whether I could hold it without letting rage drive the car. I set the recorder by the door, slid the mason jar of leftover whiskey into a zip bag inside an old cigar tin, locked it in my firebox, and told the room what I intended to do out loud so there'd be a witness. Be lawful, be steady, and don't blink. Then I lay down in boots and jacket and let the house keep watch with me until morning decided it would. I woke to a house that felt slightly wrong, the way a picture on a wall can tilt a hair and make the whole room uneasy. And when I lifted the lid of the kitchen trash, I saw the bag had been lifted out and set back and backward, the knot facing the front, when I knew I'd tied it toward the back. Nothing missing that I could swear to, except a small empty vial I didn't remember owning until yesterday, and the sudden vacancy it left behind told me more than the thing itself ever could. So I called Gary, an old friend who runs tests for animals, and when a favor is called in, for stubborn men like me. And he said what I already knew in my bones: get law on the record, then keep my head steady. So I wrote 2 neat columns on a yellow pad, what I know and what I can prove. And only the second column mattered when the day turns honest, which is how I found myself driving under a pale Missouri sky toward Ethan's subdivision, the streets named after trees that had been cut down to make room for the houses. My son opening the door with a face that passed through surprise and calculation in the span of a breath, and then settled on a version of concern he wears like a press shirt. He let me in, and the place smelled like lemon cleaner and something colder. And I stood at the edge of his kitchen where 3 untouched bottles lined the counter like they were auditioning for a photograph. And I said, Robert liked the gift, meaning the whiskey, meaning the glass that put him in a hospital bed. And Ethan didn't ask which Robert because he knew. And there it was, the smallest slip, the kind you only hear when your heart is hammering and your mind is quiet. So I took another step and told him I still had a splash of that bottle at home. And for a heartbeat, his eyes flicked as if he were watching a match near dry tinder. Then he laughed the easy laugh of a man who wants to control the temperature of the room, said, I always overthink, said I should stop making problems where there were none, and I let the silence sit long enough to make a shape between us, asked him one clean question, did you tamper with it? And counted the seconds he refused to answer, as if each tick could be laid on a table in front of a judge. Then I turned and left, because the good sense I have left told me no conversation in that kitchen would end with the truth. And the truth is what I needed if I wanted Robert to keep breathing and my own name to outlive the week. Outside, the air tasted like a coin, and I sat in my truck with the engine off and the neighborhood lawn crews droning in the distance while I dialed Detective Reyes, who listened without interrupting, asked careful questions. Who else had keys? When had I last checked the door? What exactly did my son say when I mentioned the bottle? And when we were done, he said a simple thing that felt like a plank under my feet. Don't meet him again. Document everything. We'll move when the proof is ours. I drove home by the long route, past the diner with the crooked neon coffee cup and the feed store that still sells nails by the pound. And when I stepped into my kitchen, the house exhaled like it had been waiting. So I checked the back door latch, set a cheap chirping alarm at each frame, copied Ethan's last voicemail onto an index card word for word, and slid it into the fireproof box with Linda's ring and the deed and the stack of notes I'd been keeping like a ledger of who I am when it counts. Near dusk, I took the mason jar out of the fridge, the leftover pour that had felt like an afterthought the night I passed the bottle to Robert, and held it to the window where the light ran through it as if nothing bad had ever been put in a clear liquid, then sealed it inside a tin and another bag, because caution looks a lot like love when you're doing it for the people who still call you by your first name without malice. And before the sky went fully dark, the phone rang again. Ethan's voice, lower now, asking to see me in person, saying we were making a mess, saying sooner was better than later. And I wrote that down too, line by line, because if this was going to break, it would break under the weight of what was said and done, not under what a father wished he could unknow. I slept in the chair by the front window, boots by the door, the porch light on, and even with the alarms and the locks and the careful notes, the last thing I remember before the night took me was the swing outside, giving one soft creak and wind that wasn't there, like the house itself had shifted from hoping to waiting. By late morning, I was walking the overbright halls at St. Luke's, the smell of disinfectant and burnt coffee rubbing together in the air, while monitors kept time the way a metronome keeps a student honest. And when I stepped into Robert Carson's room, he looked thinner, but stubborn, the kind of stubborn that keeps men on roofs during thunderstorms, with Linda Carson sitting straight-backed beside him like a lighthouse. I told them what I had without scaring them more than the truth already had, that Gary's first pass suggested a plant toxin, that I had a small leftover sample sealed and ready, that I'd put it in the hands of people who write things down for a living. And Robert squeezed my forearm and said, "Be lawful, but don't be slow," which was about as much permission as I needed to drive straight from the hospital to the municipal building and sit across from Detective Reyes in a room with a window that stared at a brick wall. I set the mason jar on his blotter, then the paper bag, then my stack of index cards, and he didn't touch any of it until he'd asked 3 rounds of small questions that weren't small. Who else could have a key? When did the trash bag turn around? What exact words did Ethan use when I told him I'd pass the bottle to Robert? And while he wrote, I felt something I hadn't felt in days. A plank laid over a creek so a man could cross without getting wet. He photographed the jar, labeled it, spoke chain of custody like a prayer, told me to forward every text and let every call go to voicemail. And when I stood to leave, he added, almost gently, that if I'd ever given Ethan a spare key years back, now was the time to remember it. The memory arrived like a late bus. After my heart attack, he'd brought me slippers and a phone charger, and I'd thanked him for remembering the charger, not the keys. And by the time I stopped at the hardware store for 2 deadbolts and a handful of those shrill stick-on alarms, the sun had slipped behind a gauze of cloud that made the town look tired. At home, I found a hairline scuff on the strike plate that wasn't there last week, laid a clear thread across the base of the door frame, the way an old corporal once taught me to learn whether you've had company. Swap the locks slow and careful so the screws seated true. Then stood in the kitchen with the smell of metal on my hands and called Leah, the woman who married my son and now lived in a house that suddenly had a shadow in every corner. And she met my voice with one that trembled but didn't break. She told me Ethan kept a shelf of jars in the garage labeled with masking tape, that his browser was full of pages about extractions and toxicity thresholds, that she'd taken photos months ago when curiosity still felt harmless and would hand them to Reyes if asked. And when she said she'd thought it was a hobby, I told her, hobbies don't try to stop a man's heart. Habits do. The afternoon thinned into the kind of gray that makes you think snow is hiding just out of sight, while I copied Ethan's voicemail word for word onto a card. We need to talk. Sooner is better than later. And slid it into the fireproof box beside the deed and Linda's ring and the growing stack that was starting to look like a book about a person I didn't recognize. Around 4, I drove a slow lap of my own block to see it the way a stranger might. Noticed how a car could idle half hidden by the neighbor's hedges with a clean line of sight to my porch, then parked out front and sat where anyone watching could see me not flinch. As dusk came on thin and metallic, the phone buzzed again. Another ask to meet. Another angle about keeping the police out of a family matter. And I wrote that down too, because the only thing I was going to give my son now was a record. I ate a bowl of soup standing by the sink, set the new alarms with their ridiculous chirp, checked the thread, and took the chair by the front window. Boots near the door, jacket on. Not a man waiting for trouble so much as a man who refuses to pretend he can't hear it pacing the sidewalk. And when the porch swing gave one soft creak in air that didn't move, I let it mark the hour and promised myself I'd meet tomorrow with the same two tools that had gotten me this far: steady hands and a written line of truth no one could shake loose. Morning came thin and colorless, the kind of light that makes a kitchen look honest, and I was halfway through a bowl of oatmeal I didn't want when the phone broke the quiet, and Reyes said the state lab had confirmed what Gary already knew. White snake root, no room for doubt, no room for accident, and his calm voice drew a straight line through my chest as he told me we were moving from suspicion to evidence, that he'd be filing for a warrant, and I was to answer nothing from Ethan, except with dates and times on paper. By 9, I was at St. Luke's again, the monitors soft as crickets, and Robert had a little color back, enough to grumble that hospital coffee was a crime, while Linda gripped my hand like it was the last rung of a ladder, and I told them both what the lab said and watched truth lay itself down between us, like a plank you can cross if you're careful. Leah arrived with a manila folder and a quiet that felt earned, and inside were printouts, screenshots of searches about extraction, a photo of a garage shelf lined with jars labeled in masking tape script, WSR, RR, tincture, and when she asked if she'd done the right thing, I told her, the right thing is what keeps people breathing. Then walked that folder straight to Reyes's office, where the blinds cut the room into gray stripes, and he spread the pages with a mechanic's patience, building a motor from parts he trusted, nodding once when he hit the photo of the jars as if a puzzle piece had finally admitted where it belonged. He told me to go home and stay put, so I did, threading afternoon with small, useful tasks, tightened the cold water handle so it would stop weeping, rewound the clock in the hall, then checked the thread at the front door and found it still lying obedient and white as a fuse. And I was reaching for the kettle when the cheap door alarm at the back yelped twice, and I froze and slid to the window the way an old habit teaches you. Just a delivery man wedging a padded envelope between the handle and the frame. No return address, no stamp, just my name written in block letters a stranger would use. I photographed it where it sat, then called Reyes and waited until an officer came to bag it, and when they left, the house felt both lighter and exposed, like a patient after the bandage is removed and the air finally hits the wound. Close to 3 in the afternoon, I drove to the hospital again because waiting alone felt like handing time a weapon, and sat with Robert while the game show contestants guessed wrong on questions every farmer knows. And when he drifted, I stepped into the family lounge with Leah and told her I'd installed new deadbolts and set a thread like a tripwire, that I'd stopped answering Ethan and started recording him instead. And she looked at her hands and said he'd texted her that morning asking if I was playing hero, and I told her heroes are dead men with plaques. We're just trying to live long enough to take down the plaque makers. At 5, Reyes called with the kind of brevity you learn from years of saying only what you can keep. Judge reviewing the affidavit at sunset, likely to sign. Do not be anywhere near Ethan's place when we roll. And I said I'd be home and visible. And I was, sitting by the front window with the hall light on, so anyone cruising past would see an old man not blinking. The porch swing creaked once in still air, and then settled, and I wrote down everything I had on a fresh card before sliding it into the fireproof box. State confirmation, folder, from Leah, envelope logged, warrant pending. Then made tea, and held the mug for its heat as much as the drink. Around 8, the phone buzzed from the hallway table. A voicemail that began with "Dad, you're making this worse," and ended with "Call me before they do." And I didn't, because the only answer left between us was a knock that wasn't his and a piece of paper with a seal on it. And when the night thinned toward the color of steel, I finally closed my eyes in the chair and let the day be what it was. A bridge I'd crossed without falling, ready to hear Reyes in the morning if he said the word I needed most: go. They came just after 8, with the kind of knock that makes a house sit up straighter, and when I opened the door, Reyes stood there with 2 uniforms and a plastic sleeve holding paper that looked heavier than it was, the judge's signature fresh enough to shine. He told me to stay put, keep the alarm set, answer no one who couldn't prove they belonged. And then the cars rolled away toward Ethan's subdivision while I closed my door and looked at the white thread across the threshold as if it were a prayer, then made coffee and didn't drink it because waiting turns everything bitter. By mid-morning, the rooms felt too clean, so I gave my hands work to do tightening a loose hinge on the pantry, oiling the storm door that always complained, writing a new index card for the fireproof box, warrant executed 810, and sliding it in with the others like I was laying down planks over a ditch, one careful step at a time. At 12:15, Leah texted from their bedroom, short lines that read like a heartbeat. They're in the garage, boxes, jars, and I stood at the sink, staring at the yard, while the little alarm on the back door blinked its tiny red eye. Then the phone buzzed again. Photoed the shelf. Reyes thanked me, and I pictured her standing in that doorway, spine straight, letting the official world finally touch the places I'd only guessed at. A little after 1, I drove to the Veterans Park because benches and water make minutes behave. But I kept the phone in my palm, and at 2:04, it rang, and Reyes said, "We found it." His voice flat in that practiced way that keeps things from spilling. 3 mason jars labeled in masking tape, WSR, root tox, tincture, dried material in 2, liquid in 1, a notebook with measurements and triangles like half doses, and an unsealed envelope with my name on it, and a drawing of a tree with the roots circled above the words, "You'll understand why when it's over." And when I didn't answer, right away, he added, he wasn't home. We're putting out a locate, which landed in my chest like a stone on a frozen pond. No splash, just a crack you can feel. So I told him I'd stay inside, invisible, and hung up, drove the long way back through streets that knew the sound of my truck. And when I opened my door, the thread lay exactly where I'd left it, innocent as string. And the house smelled like metal from the new locks, faint and clean. I was setting the kettle when the back alarm screamed its thin, cheap siren, and I moved to the side of the window, careful as a man who remembers how to be small, and saw no one, only the screen door easing open and shut in a breath of wind I couldn't feel, until I noticed the edge of white wedged between the handle and the frame. I disarmed the alarm, took a photograph before I touched it, then slid the paper free and read the sentence written in thick black marker. "Stop letting them in, or I will." No signature, no flourish, only the kind of handwriting people use when they don't plan to apologize. I called Reyes, and he sent Patel, who photographed the note on my table, the door jamb, the path through the grass, bagged it, and asked if I'd seen anyone. And when I said no, he told me the street cams were being pulled, that I wasn't to leave the lights off tonight, that sometimes light is a fence, and when he left the house felt both safer and more exposed, like a wound with fresh gauze. I added another card to the box, note on door, 417, and set the box back on the top shelf where I keep the things I don't want to trip over in the dark, then sat by the front window with a hall light on, so anyone cruising past could see an old man who wasn't blinking. And I thought about the jars and the notebook and that ridiculous drawing of roots, as if the man who wrote it believed poison could ever be a lesson. And I let the anger come and then let it go, because anger is a tool you don't use for long if you want to keep your hands. Near dusk, Leah texted again. Detective's gone, house quiet. And I replied with 2 words, thank you, and put the phone face down, because I didn't want his name to light my room if it didn't have to. By nightfall, the porch swing made one quick creak in air that didn't move, and I sat there in the chair where I'd slept 2 nights running, the little alarm chirping once when I tested it, the thread glinting like a hair of frost. And I told the room what I needed it to remember. He wasn't home when they came. He'll try the door that doesn't fight back. He won't find it here. Somewhere not far off, a car idled and moved on, and I breathed with the house until the shape of the hours made sense again, ready for the next sound to be the right knock or the wrong one, and ready either way. Morning came thin and metallic, the kind of cold that bites the edge of your breath, and just after 9, the phone rang with Reyes saying they'd picked him up without a scene near a gas station off Route 19. Calm as a man buying coffee, he didn't plan to drink. And while he talked, I watched the light crawl across the kitchen floor like it was afraid to be caught moving. I didn't ask where they were taking Ethan because I already knew. I asked what they'd found after the jars and the note, and Reyes said they'd seized a spiral notebook with hard-pressed handwriting, pages of ratios and dates, little triangles that Gary later told me meant half doses, and 2 sets of initials written as neat as a ledger, RC beside a modest number and FD beside one that could stop a clock. So I sat down at the table and let the chair hold me while he said they'd also recovered a second bottle from the same limited run as the gift, opened and dusted with a faint powder that didn't belong in anything meant for celebration. I went to St. Luke's before lunch because hospitals are where the day tells the truth, and Robert was propped high, color better, mood sharp enough to cut string. And when I told him they had Ethan in custody, he nodded once like a man who'd been expecting the weather to break, then looked at me long enough for me to feel the weight of everything I wasn't saying. And Linda stood by the window with her knitting quiet in her hands and said, "You did what had to be done, Frank," in that soft voice people use when they know the price. Leah stepped in a few minutes later, hair pulled back hard like resolve, and she said she'd turned over an old laptop and screenshots of searches, extraction methods, toxicity charts, how to mask bitterness and spirits. And she didn't cry. She just stood straighter and said, "I'm sorry, not for him, for this." And I told her we'd let the law carry what it's built to carry and leave the rest for the slow work of breathing. By early afternoon, Reyes called me to the station for a formal statement, and when I walked into the small room with the glass that lets you see only one way, He slid a clear sleeve toward me, and there were the notebook pages, my son's loops and dents, and the patient cruelty of careful numbers. And Gary's voice came through a speaker on the table, saying that the FD line wasn't just dangerous. It was designed to look like a bad heart finally doing what bad hearts do. And I thought of the doctor 3 years ago telling me to quit whiskey if I wanted to see 70, and how close a man can come to being a tidy statistic if he counts the wrong person among his blessings. I signed what needed signing, spoke what needed speaking, kept to facts because feelings don't stand up well under fluorescent lights. And when I stepped into the hallway, Leah was there with a paper bag that held the key to a storage bin Ethan had rented under an alias. And Reyes took it gently, like it was a live thing, and said they'd follow it through. By late day, a message rolled to my phone from a number I didn't know. "Don't make this worse than it is. Call me." And I wrote the words on an index card instead of answering, because obedience to my better angels had kept me living this long. And after dusk, Caldwell reached out through Reyes with talk of misunderstandings and mishandled gifts, and how no one benefits from a public reckoning. And I said nothing to that, because silence is sometimes the only clean line in a dirty room. I drove home with the radio off and the road familiar under my tires, and the thread at the base of the front door lay undisturbed. The little stick-on alarms blinked their red eyelids like they were tired of being brave, and the house smelled faintly of coffee I hadn't drunk and metal from the new deadbolts. And I stood in the doorway to the living room and looked at the fireproof box on the shelf and knew the story it held wasn't finished, just turning into something that wouldn't let anyone pretend anymore. I heated a bowl of soup and ate it standing up, because chairs felt like a luxury I hadn't earned. Then I sat by the window where a man can watch his own breath and the street at the same time, and I let my mind walk the length of the last week. Handwriting on a card, a bottle catching sun, a friend nearly gone, jars with taped names, a tree drawn with its roots circled, and that cruel little promise. You'll understand why. And I thought about how often harm comes dressed as a gift, and how the only thing left to do now was keep choosing the next right word under oath, the next right lock at night, and the next right breath, until a jury could tell us what the law already knew. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and old wood, and by mid-morning I'd memorized the hairline crack that ran from the back corner of the ceiling to the brass clock over the bench. A thin fracture that felt honest about what time does to everything. They brought Ethan in through a side door, wrists cuffed, face unreadable, and I kept my eyes on a knot in the rail until the judge called the case and the room settled into that careful quiet where truth and performance start to look like twins. The prosecutor didn't give a speech. This wasn't a movie. He simply laid out a sequence: package, bottle, hospital, lab, search, and then called Robert, who walked slow but stood straight, right hand raised, voice steady, as he told 12 strangers what it felt like to sip something he thought was a kindness, and wake up thinking his heart had decided to leave him without permission. And when Caldwell tried to steer him toward careless mixing of pills and alcohol, Robert met the suggestion with a measured, "I've taken those meds a decade without scaring my wife this way," and a few jurors wrote something down while the rest just watched him breathe. Gary testified next in a clean blue shirt and working man's tie, explaining white snake root the way a patient teacher explains electricity, not dramatic, just precise. The extraction, the dosage curve, why bitterness can be masked, and Caldwell did what defense lawyers do, floated contamination and amateur testing, until the state chemist took the stand to confirm Gary's findings without poetry, just the math of poison. Reyes followed with the warrant, the jars labeled with masking tape, the notebook with its triangles and initials, the open half-empty bottle from the same limited run. And when Caldwell pushed chain of custody like a man leaning on a weak post, Reyes walked the court through dates, times, signatures, seals, the whole unbroken line, and you could feel the room concede the paper had held. My turn came after lunch, the oath tasting like metal on my tongue, and I told it plain as I could. The handwriting I knew, the bottle I couldn't drink, the moment I handed it to a man I trusted, the way silence fills a house when you realize your peace has been rented out to fear. And Caldwell came at me with history, not evidence. Property decisions after Linda died, a cooling of Sundays, long hurts dressed up as motives, and I sat still and answered like I was tightening a bolt. Yes, the years were hard. No, I didn't mistake my son's letters. Yes, I went to the police before I went to anyone else because graves don't argue back. And when he said, "Isn't this just an old grudge playing itself out?" I said, "Old grudges don't put men in hospitals." And the judge told him to move on. Leah took the stand with a laptop that had seen better days and eyes that hadn't, explained the folders, the screenshots, the searches for bitterness masking and dosage by body weight, and Caldwell tried to file them under curiosity until the timestamps aligned with the week the bottle shipped, and the judge, who had been patient all morning, stopped being patient and denied his suppression motion with 3 short sentences that sounded like doors closing. In the hallway, during a recess, a deputy escorted Ethan past me, and he leaned just enough to whisper, "You're doing this to yourself," which is the kind of line men use when they've lost the room but still want the last word. And I answered, without raising my voice, "I'm doing this so I get another birthday." And the deputy kept him moving. Back inside, Caldwell called a handwriting expert who said a person of reasonable caution might question the note on the package, and the prosecutor didn't fight the academic hedging. He simply put up a shipping record with Ethan's email and a pickup form with his signature. And the jurors didn't need a lesson in penmanship to follow money in motion. By late afternoon, the judge told us we'd resume in the morning for closings, which is a formal way of saying we'd all have to go home and carry our versions of the truth like heavy groceries through the dark. So I walked the steps slow, nodded to Robert and Linda, squeezed Leah's shoulder once, and drove the long way back past the river where the water looked like hammered tin under a flat sky. At the house, the little alarms blinked like tired sentries, and the thread at the bottom of the door frame lay where I'd left it, undisturbed and honest. And I made eggs I didn't want, ate them because a man has to keep the machine running if he means to see things through. Then sat at the table with the fireproof box open and copied today's facts onto cards. Testimony, exhibits, denials, the hallway whisper, stacking them in order, until the story stopped shaking in my hands. Somewhere after 9, a truck idled by the curb and moved on, and I listened to it leave like a man measuring distance, then clicked off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway, looking at the quiet shapes of my living room. The places where loss had pulled threads and where resolve had stitched them back as neat as an old hand can manage. And I told myself out loud, not for courage, but for clarity, tomorrow I finish saying what needs saying. Then I locked both deadbolts and let the house hold me through the long, honest night. Morning came thin and pale and honest, and I put on the same jacket as yesterday because I wanted the day to know I hadn't changed my mind in the dark. Back at the courthouse, the floor wax smell was already awake, the brass clock over the bench ticking like a small hammer. And when the judge took her seat, the prosecutor rose without theatrics and talked about a simple line that ran from a box on my porch to a bed in the ICU. A line drawn by handwriting, chemistry, and choices. He didn't raise his voice. He just set each fact on the rail like a brick and let the weight make the argument for him. Then he paused the right amount and said the word trust, as if it were a tool you either use well or swing like a weapon. And I watched 2 jurors nod without meaning to. Caldwell's closing moved like oil across a floor, smooth and quick. Reasonable doubt braided with family. History. A man's grief repurposed as motive. An expert's caveat inflated into a parachute. And when he gestured toward me with open palms, a father wounded, not a witness reliable. I kept my eyes on the knot in the wood and reminded myself a plank can hold even if someone calls it crooked. The judge charged the jury with the law in calm sentences that sounded like instructions for lifting something heavy without snapping your back. Then the 12 filed out with their notebooks, and the door shut behind them, leaving the rest of us in that hollow space where time swells and shrinks by turns. In the hall, the vending machine hummed like an old fridge. Robert sat with his cane across his knees and his jaw set. Linda knit 3 neat rows and then forgot to count and had to pull them out. Leah handed me a paper cup of coffee that tasted like last night's water but felt hot enough to hold. And Reyes leaned against the wall with his tie loosened half an inch, giving me the look men give when they'd like to say hope but have learned to say wait. An hour crawled by. Then a bailiff brought a note. The jury wanted the text thread to the burner phone and the state lab's dosage chart. And I felt something in my chest unclench, because people who ask for maps intend to find their way. Caldwell tried one more move, filing a scribbled motion about undisclosed bias in the chemist's past testimony, and the judge read it with the patience you reserve for a child past bedtime and denied it in under a minute, saying the record spoke just fine without anyone shouting over it. At 2:15, we were told to stay close. At 2:30, the foreman asked for a readback of Gary's explanation on masking bitterness. The court reporter obliged in that metronome voice all good readers have, and I remembered Sundays on the porch with Linda, one small glass and crickets, and the kind of silence that blesses instead of bruises. By 3, the jury bell clanged, not loud but final, and we filed in as if we were walking onto ice. Ethan came through the side door, wrists chained, expression studied to blank, and for a second I saw the boy the world never met, the one who tugged my sleeve at the veteran's fountain and asked if finishing the mission meant you got your name carved in stone. Then the moment was gone, and he was a man again, staring at the spot over the judge's shoulder like it might blink. The foreman stood with a paper that looked small in his hands. The judge asked if a verdict had been reached. He said yes, and the silence that followed was so complete I heard my pulse in my ear and the soft click of Linda's knitting needles as she froze them in midair. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, the foreman said, "We find the defendant guilty." And the word didn't crash or echo. It landed the way a true thing lands, with the dull gravity of a stone in wet dirt. And for one long breath, I understood why roofs hold when you lay the shingles right. Caldwell's mouth tightened. Ethan didn't blink. Leah covered her mouth and then took her hand away like she'd remembered not to hide. Robert's cane tapped once against the bench and went still. The judge thanked the jury and set sentencing for next week, her cadence steady as someone folding a flag. And when the bailiff turned Ethan toward the door, he glanced back at me, not pleading, not raging, just measuring, and his lips moved barely enough to shape 3 words I couldn't hear, though I knew the shape of them by feel. This isn't over. And then he was gone down a hallway I didn't follow. Outside, the air had sharpened into late afternoon. Traffic hissed along the avenue. Reyes came out and said, "You did fine," like it was a verdict of its own. Robert squeezed my elbow once the way working men say the right thing without putting it on a poster. And I stood there with the sun in my eyes and the cold in my throat and realized justice doesn't lift you. It steadies you, like a hand on your back at the top of stairs. And tomorrow there would be sentencing and paperwork and a stack of knights that didn't know what to do with themselves. But for this 1 minute, I let my lungs fill all the way and hold. Because after 3 years of sleeping with the door inside me half open, I finally heard the click of a lock that worked. Sentencing came on a Wednesday, under a pewter sky that wouldn't make up its mind about rain. And when the judge read the number out loud, 25 years, 15 before parole, the room exhaled in that low human way crowds do when they've reached the end of a hard page. I didn't look at Ethan when the cuffs clicked. I looked at the grain of the rail and thought about all the ways wood holds together if you drive the nails straight. And after it was done, I walked out with Reyes, who said, "You stood up," like it was a simple act, and Robert, who tapped my elbow with the cane and added, "You stayed up," which felt closer to the truth. The week after, life didn't rush back so much as trickle, the way a faucet does after a winter freeze, sputtering at first and then finding itself. Mornings, I fixed small things for no one in particular. A loose hinge on the shed, the porch swing chain that had squealed for months, the lamp in Linda's sewing room that needed a new pull. And afternoons I drove to St. Luke's with magazines and the kind of jokes that don't require energy to laugh at, just permission. Robert got stronger, color back in his face by Thanksgiving. And when we sat in his kitchen with chicken soup steaming between us, he slid a sealed envelope across the table. Restitution paperwork, a number the court would chase, not me. And I pushed it back, telling him the only debt I wanted settled was the one already paid by his pulse-keeping time. Sometime near dusk that same day, Leah called to say she'd boxed up what the court didn't need. Old cleats, a cracked glove, a snow globe from a trip we took when Ethan was 10, and asked if I wanted any of it. I drove over after supper, stood in the garage that still smelled faintly of oil and dry leaves, and kept one thing: a photo of him at the lake with a fish too small to brag about and a grin too big to hide. Then I thanked her for telling the truth when it cost her comfort, and she thanked me for not making her choose sides she was never really on. Letters started arriving from the prison before the first hard frost, the handwriting too familiar to throw away and too sharp to invite inside. So I read them on the porch with my coat zipped and my jaw set. Some lines were angry, and some were clever, and none were clean. And when he wrote that, he'd found a chapel job sweeping floors at 5 in the morning, I pictured him pushing a broom across tile that didn't care who he'd been. And I wrote back twice, plain and short. No forgiveness traded like currency, just facts about the weather and the yard, and a line about Linda's rose bush surviving another winter, because some things you protect out of respect, not hope. On Sundays, I started showing up at the veterans' breakfast down at the old Legion Hall, pouring coffee, wiping tables, listening more than talking, because men who break and keep going know how to send a room forward without a speech. Reyes dropped by once with a sack of catfish and a loaf of cornbread his sister made, said the last appeal had been denied, said I should think about a vacation, even if it's just a county road I haven't driven yet. And I told him I might head west when the snow lifts, chase a morning on the Columbia where the sun hits the water like it's remembering something good. In the evenings, when the wind knifed down from the bluffs, I built small box from leftover cedar and brass hinges, sanded it smooth, lined it with the dark green. Felt Linda used to keep for ornaments, and I put inside the vial Gary tested, the burner phone printout, the photo from the lake, and the last letter I didn't answer. Then I clicked it shut and wrote fragile on the underside where no one would see, because fragile things deserve truth more than display. Christmas Eve, just after 8, I drove to the Carsons with a pecan pie and 2 thermoses of spiced tea. And when Robert asked if I'd ever drink again, I said no. Not because of fear, but because a man can decide what he won't be anymore. Midnight found me on my porch swing. The chain's quiet now, the yard silvered with a dusting that might stick by morning. And I thought about lines you can't uncross and bridges you can choose not to burn, and how sometimes the bravest thing a heart does is keep time without asking for applause. I don't know if peace is a place you arrive or a thing you build with stubborn hands, but I know it looks like this: locks that don't rattle, a stove that clicks and holds a flame, neighbors waving from trucks salted white, a phone that can ring without owning you, and a sky that doesn't promise anything it can't deliver. So I lifted my mug to the empty yard and to the rooms that remembered laughter without collapsing under it. And I said, to no one and to everyone who might need it, here's to the work of staying. Here's to the mercy of ordinary days. And I went inside, turned off the hall light, and let the house rest.